Do you hear me?
Yeah.
Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight. We're going to give it a few minutes to let people sign in, and then we'll get started. Okay. Hi, Rick.
Yeah.
So there's a chat box feature. I don't know, maybe you've seen the bubble kind of popping up. So
Yeah.
Yeah. So sometimes people like to include comments or questions in there, but we can tell them however you'd like to do it. Like type questions there and we'll address them later.
Yeah. Tell people that you'll have your mic open, right? So you can like moderate.
Yeah.
So why don't you just handle that part? Like, let me take like 30 minutes and run through it.
Okay.
And then you can ask questions. They can type them. They can, however you want to handle it.
Sounds good. That's perfect.
Hey.
Thanks. All right, well, do you want to get going, or did you want to?
I'm listening. I've never used this program, so I don't really know how it works.
I'd say we get started here, and people might still trickle in, but let's give it a go. If you're ready.
Sure.
Cool. All right, well, hello everyone. Thanks for joining us on this Thursday evening. We're very excited to have Rick Hess joining us tonight, talking about his brand new book that's out, The Cage Busting Teacher. If you have any questions, there's a chat box. Feel free to type those in there, and we'll get to them kind of towards the end. Comments as well. Otherwise, we hope you enjoy. It's going to be a great presentation.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Ed Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute in D.C. Good to be with you guys this evening. Some of you may have been through this before. If so, I hope it's not too tedious sitting through some of this again. For those of you who have not, terrific. As I think many of you know, NSTOY has been a terrific partner, like so many others have in this work, and I am much obliged. Well, who am I and what's going on? I have not been in a classroom, in a K-12 classroom since the last century. Actually, go ahead and leave it back on the other one for that one. Thanks. I have not been in a K-12 classroom since the last century. The last place anybody should be claiming to give direction on, curriculum and instruction. Just 1 second. Sorry about that. The perils of trying to do this from home in the evening. The last place anybody should be trying to give direction on curriculum and instruction, scope and sequence, I think, is from the 10th floor of a DC office building. And fortunately, that's not what I'm trying to do in this book or talk with you guys about tonight. What I tend to do is I spend most of my time thinking about questions of education policy. I teach at a few universities. I write books, I write blogs, I spend a lot of time talking to public officials, and that's the world that I live in. But it's interesting, is I've spent a lot of time over the last decade or more, last couple decades, doing this work. One of the things that has struck me is how often I would talk to educational leaders, school leaders, system leaders, state leaders, who were interesting people with good ideas.
Just listening, you're not on your phone.
And all righty, I would talk to interesting people with good ideas, and they would say, "Hey, I'd love to try this," and I'd say, "Well, gosh, why don't you?" And they'd say, "Well, I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed because that's not a permissible use of federal funds. That's not allowed because that's not how the state recognizes teacher of record, whatever." And I'm being a skeptical guy. I'd say, well, you know what? That doesn't sound quite right. And what I found was the more we would look into it, the more I learned that well over half the time, these leaders could do the things that they were sure they could not do. The problem was urban myth. The problem was bad habits. The problem was mentoring that was used to seeing the world a certain way. So a couple years ago, I wrote a book called The Cage Busting Leader. In it, I argued that leaders in education are often stuck in what I termed cages of their own design. These are not real things they cannot do, but they are things that they think they cannot do. And, the book's done reasonably well. I've, had a lot of opportunities to talk, to state gatherings of their superintendents or to the principals in a district or what have you. And a lot of those times there were teacher leaders present. And one of the things that I was interested about was how those teachers might respond, because I was saying leaders need to be more aggressive about rethinking how they staff schools, about reading contracts. Even the union reps weren't particularly bothered by any of that. Instead, teachers of the year, union reps, folks in other networks would come up after and they'd say, Rick, some of this is pretty interesting, But here's the problem. That whole second half of your talk about what do you do with this was totally unhelpful for me. And I would say, why is it unhelpful? And one guy, I can't remember.
Hi, if you're not on mute, could you please mute your...
Yeah. Nice. Good.
Sorry, Rick. I'm
That's all right.
trying to manage.
Yeah, it's so unique.
If anyone's not on
I
mute,
was telling my neighbor about it this morning who knows nothing about education.
I don't know.
That's freaking cool, man.
Okay, got it. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay. So, I can't remember who it was, but he came up to me, he said, Rick, problem is, what you're talking about isn't my cage. He said, an administrator's cage may be, what they can do with Title II or state regs. He's like, my cage is that my principal's an idiot. My school board doesn't support my program. My association is in left field, and policymakers don't care what I think. He's like, what do you got for me? And I said, you know what? I got nothing. And this book, Cage Busting Teacher, which will be officially out and available on Amazon and stuff, I think, end of April. But you guys, because you're Enstoy, we're doing this a little early. This book is an attempt to help folks answer that question. Next slide. Now, this little guy, like young folks do, getting their hands on it early. But like I said, if you go on Amazon or Kindle and they tell you a book's not available yet, don't sweat it. It'll be available shortly. Next slide. So look, what is the teacher's cage? For me, it's real simple. When folks at Gallup, for instance, ask teachers about whether they feel like they have a voice in their school, 80% say no. When they ask them how much control they have over what happens in their school, 75% say little or none. Yet, 85% of teachers give their principals marks as terrific, as excellent, or good. I got to tell you, when you're in an environment where most people feel like they don't have a say and they don't have any control, and yet 9 out of 10 say their boss is doing a good job, you are in this cage where dysfunction has become the norm. We see this time after time with professional development. Whether it's Gary Rubenstein or Linda Darling-Hammond, nobody thinks very many educators are happy with most of the PD they get. Yet when you look at the surveys, 80 or 90% of teachers say they like their PD. What's going on? I think what we've had is teachers have gotten so used to lousy PD, to feeling disempowered, to lousy leadership, to destructive routines, to schools that waste their time, energy, and passion, that they don't even think of this as atypical. This has become the norm. And so what happens is we've created a classroom cage in which teachers say, you know what, the school's a mess. I'm going to close my door and I'm just going to teach because at least there I've got control of what's going on. Next slide. In fact, we haven't just gotten used to the cage. Teachers tend to romanticize the cage. So, whether it is, Stand and Deliver or a Dead Poets Society or anything else in between, most of our heroic teachers are these people who fight the system, who, are stuck in schools that are at best indifferent to their efforts, at worst actively undermining their efforts. And through sheer perseverance and heroic effort, these teachers somehow manage to triumph. And we have, in popular imagination, come to think about this as the whole of good teachers. And in fact, interviewing 300 teacher leaders, give or take, over the last 18 months, it's amazing how often teachers have internalized this notion that that their job is to fight against these things and take them as part and parcel of how it works. And look, that would all be fine if teachers operated like psychiatrists with the home office. if teachers went home, if teachers woke up in the morning and put on their, a suit and went downstairs and patients came to see them, teachers could just close the door and do their own thing because it wouldn't matter what happened around you. The reality, of course, is that teachers are in the middle of these schools. And if schools have lax discipline, if they blow substitute coverage and so have to pull teachers out of their prep periods to cover, if they come on willy-nilly with announcements to disrupt homeroom or last period, what happens is it undermines the ability of even those teachers who want to retreat to their classroom to just go ahead and do things well. But it's worse than that, because when teachers get out of that cage, they can actually create schools and systems where they're able to do their best work, where the meetings are useful, the PD is constructive, where colleagues talk to each other as colleagues and mentors. Next. So let's just talk about the cage just in a touch more detail, right? What is it? There's at least 4 key elements that come up time and again when you talk to folks. One is the isolating culture. Teachers in their egg crate classrooms, spending remarkably little time interacting with other adults, little time, if any, actually talking to anybody from central administration, and teachers feeling really like they're on their own. Next. Second, teachers report being told time after time to stay in their lane. This is certainly not unique to traditional district schools. Madeline Edison, founder of Educators for Excellence out of Minnesota, was a third-year teacher in a newish teacher in a third-year charter school. School didn't have any of the systems in place that newish teachers need, like good curricular materials and guides. She went to some of her more veteran colleagues and said, hey, how do we get this stuff built? In a newish charter school, they said to her, hey, that's not our job as teachers. You're just going to drive yourself crazy banging your head into that. Stay in your lane. Third, churning leadership. Many of you guys on this call probably know Peggy Stewart, New Jersey Teacher of the Year a decade ago. Acclaimed teacher, built this terrific, much talked about Model UN program, other programs in a rural Jersey district, had to do a graduation ceremony from the Great Wall of China because her students so didn't want to miss the trip, but didn't want to miss graduation. New superintendent comes to town, wasn't crazy about her, didn't feel like her and her colleagues were focused on his priorities, dismantled it, made it harder for them to meet, took their programs apart. Not surprisingly, superintendent gone a year later because that's how it works. But as a result, Peggy Stewart had already left the district and said, you know what, this is crazy. So time after time, teachers with great ideas are like folks building sandcastles at the water's edge. Next. And you get policy that doesn't make sense because you've got policymakers trying to do the right things for kids, trying to safeguard taxpayers, but they're so far removed from schools and classrooms that their best efforts don't always pay off. In fact, frequently they don't. In the book, I talk about Alex Lopes, who some of you know, Florida Teacher of the Year a couple of years ago, taught pre-K special ed. Obviously, you don't have value-added scores. So the Florida Accountability System, you use school-wide scores. So here we've got the Florida Teacher of the Year teaching in Miami-Dade in a high-poverty school, winds up being scored as a lousy, ineffective teacher. If Alex wanted to be able to be in leadership positions or even be assured of keeping a job, wound up not because of choice, but because of necessity, moving to a suburban district. So you wind up with systems that not because anybody's malicious, but just because that's how the world works, wind up putting teachers in positions where they can't do their best work. Next. So what happens? So teachers get frustrated. In the book, I talk about Casey Jones, Memphis, Tennessee. As many of you know, Memphis was one of the model sites for the Gates Measures of Effective Teaching program. One of the elements of that program, the tripod survey, trying to get student voice. At the time, it was only going to be a small element of teacher evaluation, not linked to pay, but the idea was it would be a bigger role over time. Casey's okay with this. She says, look, I think students have a lot of value to say. We got to be careful about how we use it, but there's real value here. Other of her colleagues had a stronger reaction. And she says, look, a lot of when we wound up to sit and talk about this turned into complaint sessions. But her complaint wasn't with the principle of using student voice. It was that she teaches elementary special needs kids. And she says the tripod instrument was 75 questions long. She couldn't get her students to sit down and fill out a 75-question survey, so she was getting crushed. What happens is an idea that she was sympathetic to winds up being destructive, not because it's necessarily a bad idea, but because of how it's being put into place. So what happens? Next. So teachers wind up stuck in a cage. Great example, Maddie Fennell, who's a friend, who many of you know, and is a good friend, and I were teaching some of this stuff out at ESET 2 out in Snowbird last year. Terrific teacher, terrific crowd. One really impressive seeming person in the audience, she stood up, she said, you know, I hear what you guys are talking about, but here's the problem. My principal is just such a knucklehead, it drives me crazy. And Maddie or I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, so we've got a school, we got a letter from the superintendent last year that we're, you know, in need of improvement. And so our principal is now crazy to move up our ELA scores. And so he mandated that we all have to use direct reading assessment. And she said, it doesn't make any sense for me. She said, through guided reading, I get everything I need. And this is half an hour a kid for 30 kids, beginning of year, middle of year, end of year. It's killing me. And we said, well, any reason your principal might have thought this was a good idea? She said, yeah, because he's an idiot. We said, all right. Any other reason? She said, well, look, we've got some younger teachers. Yeah, my kids are all 90% plus proficient, but I know we've got some teachers who are having more trouble. Maybe for them it would be helpful, but he's making us all use it. So I think Maddie said, well, what did you tell your principal? And she said, well, I told him he's an idiot. And we were like, well, how'd that work out for you? And so part of the problem here is that teachers get so frustrated that they wind up not actually engaging with these things as problem solvers or professionals, but acting out of frustration. Next. In fact, it gets worse than that, because they don't just get frustrated, they wind up getting angry. And when you're angry, you wind up saying hateful things, you say angry things, and so you get Michael Mulgrew talking about reformers as trying to destroy education in New York City. And what that signals to policymakers and what that signals to quote-unquote reformers is that teachers are hostile to trying to do better. Now, it's interesting because the folks who show up and are angry are not most teachers, in my experience. It's 10%, 20% of teachers, but those are the people who get heard. Those people become the face of the profession. And so what happens is policymakers and reformers and even district leaders wind up thinking that teachers can't be trusted and that they have to work as hostile forces. So what do you do about all this? Next slide. Well, what you do about this is, the reason I wrote this book is in talking to these teachers after Cage Busting Leadership, I realized, like I said, that they were right. And one of the things they were right about was that teachers have a different kind of authority than leaders do. Leaders have what sociologists call positional authority. They get to move dollars around. They get to hire people. They get to change job descriptions. That's not really the nature of most teachers' authority. Teachers instead have two other kinds of authority. One, teachers have what political scientists call the expert of street-level bureaucrats. Teachers see what happens when rubber meets road. They see how teacher evaluation systems are playing out. They see where new assessments are or are not working. They see how extended learning time is actually affecting what happens in classrooms and schools, for better and worse. So one, teachers just have an enormous amount of concrete expertise that often does not get shared or does not get shared productively. Second, teachers have a potentially immense moral authority, not because they're teachers and we're supposed to love them, but for the same reason that pediatricians and frankly plumbers can win a lot of trust from people. If you've got a little kid or you've got pipes that you're worried about, all you really want is a number in your cell phone that when you call them, you think they're going to be responsive, they're going to be good at their job, and you think they're going to meet your needs. And if they do that, you are going to have a lot of faith in them. Now, the trick is, if you've got a pediatrician you love, but she's at a practice of 5 pediatricians, and one of them isn't necessarily all in the game or all on board, it's not enough that you trust your pediatrician. She's also got to do a good job of making sure you trust her partners. If you get that one bad pediatrician, it can undermine your faith in the entire practice. This is a big part of the problem in education. How do I know that? Because teachers say so. Teachers say that 70% of teachers say that there's a teacher or one or more teachers in their building who should not be teaching. Teachers give 5% of the teachers in their district an F and another 8% a D. We're not talking about a lot of people here. We're talking probably 10% of teachers maybe. We're talking 2 or 3 teachers in a building. There's that many people who are lousy in every line of work, whether it's think tanks or law firms or pro football. So there's nothing particularly egregious about being honest about this, but teachers have often felt, and particularly the unions, like they are supposed to protect the profession by protecting everybody. And this has made it enormously difficult to harness that professional authority, which is so powerful in terms of getting people to take teacher expertise seriously. Now, next slide. Now, a lot of this isn't really teachers' fault per se. For one thing, teachers get no training or mentoring on this. If you read the most commonly assigned textbooks teachers read, you read the books that teachers buy online, you look at what gets taught in teacher preparation, they get little or no advice on how to interact with adults, on how to deal with bureaucracy, on how to hold their principals accountable. The vast majority of what they get is on classroom practice, on culture, on multiculturalism, on classroom communication. This is all good and fine. It makes sense, but it leaves teachers frequently ill-equipped for how they actually are then supposed to get out of this classroom cage and create schools and systems where they can do their best work. Now, one other important point to keep in mind, which is how we got here. Next slide. Which is, it often feels to teachers that this conversation is about what teachers are doing wrong. And so teachers then get angry and defensive, and then policymakers and reformers then treat teachers as part of the problem. I think that's the wrong way to think about this. We've got a system of schools that was not built to educate all of our children to high levels in the 21st century. It was not built to attract and cultivate great professional educators. We've got a system that started back in the mid-1600s in Massachusetts Bay Colony with the first statutory ed law in 1647, that was built out in the middle of the 1800s to get kids off the street and to make Catholic children less Catholic, and which was built upon a teacher labor market where 55% of college-educated women became teachers as late as the 1950s. It's not that our schools today are good or bad, I don't think, and I don't think that's the right way to focus. It's that the schools we've inherited were built to solve a particular set of challenges and problems, and those aren't really what we're focused on today. And if teachers can listen to policymakers and quote-unquote reformers with that in mind, it can help them make sense of the stuff in a way that can feel less hostile. Next slide. In fact, rather than the standoff that we're trapped in, where it feels like it's educators against these philanthropists, and advocates, and reformers, I think there's actually another way to go about this stuff. And that's really kind of the thrust of Cage Busting Teacher. Next slide. Look, there's a couple key points here. One, cage busting teaching is not something you do. It's not some new strategy of classroom practice. It's not some new flavor. It's not something you do instead of being a great classroom practitioner. Basically, it entails taking what works for good teachers in their classrooms and using it to create the kinds of schools and systems where they can do their best work. Simple rule of thumb, anything which drains time or energy or leaves teachers with less ability to teach in their classrooms, it's not cage busting. Cage busting is the force multiplier, where it's about teachers being able to multiply the time, energy, and passion that they're able to bring to the classroom. Next slide. So let's talk about this real quick. There's 3 key steps to cage busting. First is to identify a problem. Here's a simple example. There's an outfit called Clever, which works with about 15 or 20,000 schools. They have found out by interviewing teachers and by surveying them that about 25% of classroom technology time, 25% is wasted on setup, troubleshooting, or login. When we talk to teachers about blended environments and iPad adoption, we often spend a lot of time talking about here's why systems are buying this stuff, what to do with it. We spend remarkably little time on these practical, concrete problems that can drive teachers crazy. Next. So the first step is identify a problem. Next step, once you've identified problems, since you've identified opportunities to do better, is talking about solutions. Next, please. The way to talk about solutions, for instance, with that woman at ESET, was not to tell the principal that he's driving you crazy or he's an idiot. It's to say, you know, boss, I understand what you're trying to do here. I get the problem, but our solution here isn't actually great because you're taking me away from what I'm already doing effectively and making me do stuff that I don't need. So how do we come up with a solution which lets you have those teachers who need it use DRA, but gives me an opportunity to do what I'm already doing well? If you think about it that way, it's easy to start thinking about saying, all right, how about every teacher whose kids are performing over some threshold, it's optional whether or not they're going to go ahead and use DRA. So what we're doing is not getting into throwdowns. We're solving the problem at hand. Next, a third piece, which is critical here, is what I just said. It's actually understanding where somebody else is coming from. Next bullet. Because one of the problems that comes up time after time, is that teachers will, teachers of the year, terrific people will tell me that they have been talking to policymakers or a board or a principal, and they're not listening to them. And when I get into it, I'm not surprised. These same teachers, you ask them about how do they go about working with a student who's it's not connecting. They'll tell you about how they tried this and then that and then this and that. And then they'll keep going and if you ask them, well, when do you get frustrated and give up? They'll say, I don't. My job is to find a way to connect, to make it real, to get them interested. I say, all right, how often do you use that same mindset when you're managing up? Jeff Charbonneau, who many of you know, national teacher a couple years ago, says, look, every time I hear no from an administrator, I think of it as an educatable opportunity. How do I help them understand why they're missing the point and treat that no as an opportunity to help them do better? Next, there's also a fourth key thing. In addition to identifying the opportunity, solving the problem, empathizing. No, please, thank you. No, put it on the string. Leave it on the face. There's a fourth thing. Okay. There's a fourth thing, which is that, frankly, policymakers hear from a lot of people. Principals have 30 or 50 or 100 teachers to manage. So if it's just you saying something, it can be easy for people to tune it out. The way that you get people to lock in on you is that you get other people. You work with your colleagues to make sure that folks are on the same page. Evan Stone, founders of Educated for Excellence, has a great story on this. He was teaching in New York City, had a real breakthrough with a fifth grader who went on to a middle school the next year. In September, the boy's mom was back in his classroom saying, hey, that new school, they're not doing it. It's terrible. Evan said, don't worry, I'll go talk to the principal. We'll get it sorted out. He goes over to the principal, sits down, they chat. And the principal's like, yeah, you know what? That's nice how you did it. We're a much bigger operation. I just don't have that kind of flexibility. Evan went back to his school, puts his head on his desk. He's just depressed. Mentor of his across the hallway comes in. She asks him what's going on. He tells her. She says, you know what? Well, why don't we get all of us who worked with him the last couple of years and go talk to the principal and see what happens? So a couple of days later or the next week, 8 or 9 of them went over, had a meeting with the principal. Evan says she was a wholly different person. Oh, it was a misunderstanding. Of course we can do that. There's strength in numbers. If you are a lone wolf at a school raising problems and offering, even if you're offering solutions and empathizing, you can still feel like a thorn in the side. If you get 6, 8, 10 teachers who are doing this constructively, who never suggest a problem without also suggesting a solution, it's a whole different ballgame. Next. And in fact, that's kind of the key point to cage busting here, is that this stuff is a choice. Teachers don't have to be frustrated and trapped in their classrooms. They're choosing to be. Casey Jones, for instance, we were talking about a couple minutes ago in Memphis. She could have chosen to just give up and say, oh, this stupid Gates-funded tripod survey, they don't care what I think. And in fact, a bunch of her fellow teacher ambassadors in the district from their schools, that's kind of how they felt. She said, look, guys, before we throw in the towel, why don't we maybe see if they'll work with us? So they wrote a one-page memo saying, look, we empathize with the logic of student voice. We get why it makes sense to try it. Our problem is that the thing is so darn long, it doesn't make sense for a lot of our kids. And what happened was the district cut it in half. And Casey says, once they did that, I was actually fine with it. So if we think of these things not as people not caring about schools or not as teachers just as low man on the totem pole, but if teachers think of their opportunity to engage constructively using the problems they've identified and the solutions that they can see that nobody else does, they can be really pleasantly surprised at how often folks are interested to hear from them. Next. Now, this same kind of example applies hugely when it comes to policy. Some of you may know Christopher Ruskowski, leads the Delaware Department of Teaching and Leadership. I was with the Rodell's Teachers Council when I was working on the book, and I was chatting with them, 16 terrific, experienced teachers in Delaware, and we were talking about issues, and one of the things that drove them crazy was Delaware's race to the top winning teacher eval system. They said, problem is it's just not that helpful to be observed by my peers. Excuse me, to be observed by the administrators. They're doing too many observations. They're too rushed. They don't necessarily know my grade level or my subject. I wish I could be observed by my peers. So turns out we connected with Chris Ruskowski. He said, oh, I'm glad to hear they said that. That's great. They absolutely have that authority. He says, when the state wrote the law a year and a half ago, we thought of exactly this. And so the legislators wrote in that any district can nominate teachers to be formal state-approved peer observers, and all they need to do is have that district send that letter on their behalf, get it acknowledged by the department, and then complete 4 one-hour online modules they can do from their home. Not a single teacher had requested this, and not a single district had done it. After Ruskowski went and talked to the Rodell folks, 6 months later, I checked in with him. Not a single district had put forward a single teacher to be a peer observer. So part of the problem is policymakers feel like, wait a minute, they're going to be loath to make fights on behalf of teacher empowerment and teacher flexibility if they feel like these things aren't going to get taken advantage of. So the point is that it's not anybody's single fault. It is indeed responsibility of policymakers to be more modest, to write laws that make sense, to leave room for educators to solve problems. But educators have got to be eager to offer up solutions and to take that baton when it gets passed. Next slide. So how do you get started? I tell folks in the book, I suggest 3 easy places to get going are 1, deal with PD. Teachers know more about what's happening in PD than anybody else. Every data point other than kind of generic teacher feedback suggests teachers are really frustrated with PD. For instance, a pretty intense Boston Consulting Group study last year found that only about a quarter teachers said their PD was helpful. One neat tactic that you can use is teachers should go to the principal and say, you know what? Let's stop presenting PD until it has been approved by a committee of a couple of teachers. Let's make sure that whether it's central administration or whether it's the assistant principal, nobody's going to make us sit through PD until they've actually been vetted and can demonstrate that it's a coherent, useful kind of use of teacher time. Eliminate wasted time. One of the rules of a great book on this is Liz City up at Harvard's got a nice new book called Meeting Wise. But more generally, a simple tactic a lot of meeting experts suggest is meetings tend to fill up the available time. If you have a weekly PLC for 45 minutes, it will run 45 minutes. People will trickle in late, people will be bored. If you have other meetings, they will fill up the allotted time. So one tactic the experts suggest is call really short meetings and know exactly what the objective is. Call a 10-minute meeting, call a 20-minute meeting, because it'll take that long. But if you know what the objective is, you meet, You get it over with, everybody will be on time, and you're off to the races. And third, get parents on your side. Again, teachers often try to do this by themselves. It's exhausting, it wears them out. That's not the cage-busting approach. Cage-busting approach is how do you change your school or your system so that they are putting in place new systems to reach out to parents, to connect parents, to make sure parents are getting the information they need, to use technology to make it easier to talk to parents, to put support staff who can help you. The answer cannot be teachers in their classroom burning the candle at both ends to overcome dysfunctional schools and systems. It's teachers picking the lock of that cage to turn the school and system into something that supports their best work. Last slide. Few tips here. One is I was talking about the teachers in this book, and many did for this crowd, for you guys, this is obvious. People would kept saying, oh, well, that's easy. They got a great principal. Well, one of the things that's striking is that when you identify opportunities to do better, you offer solutions, you come with empathy, you get things done, you build trust, and guess what? You keep doing those things, your principal becomes great. So the idea that these folks have great principals is partly a reflection that they make their principals great. Second, people say, well, these guys you're talking about, Rick, they got lucky. They're in the right school, the right system. The response I always quote is Thomas Jefferson had, I think, the best line on this. He said, I am a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the luckier I get. The key thing is to focus on solving problems with the expertise that only teachers possess and to build that moral authority of the profession by working together to make sure that those teachers who aren't upholding it are either starting to do so or go off and find another line of work. Those are the conditions that let teachers really be cage busters and make a difference. All righty, guys, with that, I'm happy to take any questions, comments, pushback, what have you. There you go.
I'm going to pull up the, so as we said earlier, you're welcome to, well, first of all, thank you, Rick. That was great. For any questions and comments, feel free to type them in the chat box, or there's a little microphone with a red line through it. If you click that, you should be able to speak in. Either way. Any questions?
All right, well, we can all make it a longer evening. That's okay, too.
Okay. Oh, wait, let's see. Oh. There's a question. What were some of the trends that Rick and his team found amongst the teachers they interviewed?
You want to say a bit more about what you have in mind there?
I believe Catherine, who typed this in, either type more or unmute yourself.
I mean, I'll just say at a high level, let me just say this, that, I mean, again, this was in no way, shape, or form representative of anything. This was 300 teacher leaders, some union leaders, other kind of quote unquote reform-minded networks. Folks pointed it to us by, Joy and Hope Street Group, and America Achieves, and Teach for America, and National Board, and yada, yada, yada. So they're not representative in any way, shape, or form. But, I mean, I think one thing that was striking was how many of these accomplished, respected teachers just totally took for granted that every time you stuck your head up out of your classroom, it was going to be a waste of your time. That every time you sat on a committee, every time you went to talk to your principal, so many of them felt like this was going to get them enmeshed in school politics. It was going to pick fights. It was not going to accomplish very much. And so the better use for their time was to stay in their classroom and work with their kids and write micro grants and do this. So that was one, was how many people seem to feel that way despite their success in the profession. A second trend was that a lot of teachers are excited about the chance to lead and express voice. But for my money, some of it's actually little disconcerting. It seems like a lot of these networks and advocates are trying to get teachers to spend their time going to the State House to testify or to rally or to talk to people about teacher eval or Common Core or whatever at a high level. And the reason I find it a little disconcerting is because this is something teachers either have to miss school to do, which they seem not to like, thank God, or they're doing it weekends or summers or whatever. And the reality is that it's good to have teacher voices in those State House conversations, but if you don't already have a trust-based relationship with policymakers, they're not going to listen to you that much. Second thing is there's a lot of people and a lot of other factors at that kind of political state-level decision that may or may not reflect, other than instructional expertise. So teachers can spend a lot of energy and not have that much impact. And third, you know what? The formal law that comes out of the legislature, whether it's No Child Left Behind or Senate Bill 736 in Florida on teacher evaluation or what have you, actually is only about 10% of the ballgame. 90% of the ballgame is how that law gets interpreted by state level officials, how it gets translated by lower level state officials, how districts put it into practice. And frankly, it's at those levels where teachers' expertise is likely to have a really outsized effect. So one of the things I'm a little nervous about is how some of these efforts seem to be getting teachers into things that can soak up a lot of their time and energy and won't necessarily solve the problems that are driving them crazy day to day in their school. And I'm a big fan of instead teachers starting by identifying problems and solving problems in their school or in their system, and then using that credibility and those relationships as they build those relationships and build that trust to then worry about higher levels of policy.
Great, thank you. We have another question from Michael. He says that he's trying to bring others in terms of cage busting, he's trying to bring others in and it can lead to almost a split in the building or district. And his question is, what about the cages that are put around you when you get a reputation for cage busting? Pushback from some who benefit from another design.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So there's a couple things. So one, cage busting is not a solo activity. The best way to bust a cage is not by running through it with your head. The best way to bust a cage is by dismantling it, by picking the lock. And frankly, and that means strength in numbers. And so the first thing is not to cage busting is not about trying to pick faculty fights. It's about doing those things that let you be successful in your classroom, setting the school up to help you succeed. So today on my EdWeek blog, for instance, I wrote about a fellow, some of you know, Jeff Austin out in LA. He and his colleagues kind of created a teacher-run school within a school, which later on grew to the Humanitas Academy out in LA, which hugely successful kind of teacher-created school. That's one way to go. Second way to go is you create a grade level team in which folks, are either on board or you're encouraging the folks on that who are not on board. You're working with the principal and the AP to get folks either working at another grade level next year or to opt into another school so that you're creating a cohesion there. Now, but to Michael's more specific point, what if you're doing this stuff in an environment where people are hostile to you solving problems? Well, look, at the end of the day, all of us are made better or worse by the teams on which we play. Every ball player that's true of, every lawyer that's true of, every academic, we are better or worse depending on the quality of our relationships with the colleagues we have and the people around us. So I think one of the things I say at the end of the book is, look, if you're in a position where you can't do your best work, I talked to too many teachers who seem to feel like it was a betrayal to look at another school, to look at another position, to look at, and it's not. If teachers are in a place where they are not being, troublemakers, they are not trying to be, hotheads, they're trying to identify opportunities to do better, they're offering solutions, they're operating with empathy, and people are holding it against them, then I think it's fair to say that teachers should go look for a place where they can do their best work and will be welcome in doing so. Because frankly, anything else is to enable dysfunctional environments and dysfunctional leadership.
Okay. And Jennifer's question is, some of us may feel more confident as STOIs or nationally board certified, but what are some ways we can encourage all teachers to find their voices and courage?
That's a great question. And it goes a little bit to Michael's too, because, the last thing I'm in favor of is, disrupting people's lives or making them, people have got families to feed, they've got, connections to community. So the question is really for cage busting, how do you help people kind of bust those cages in a way that lets them live the professional life they want to lead? And look, some teachers, it's, the last thing you want to do if you're like a rookie, if you're like a freshman, basketball player on like the Kentucky basketball team. Well, that's not a good example. If you're like a freshman player on like a high school team, and you're lucky enough to play varsity, you're supposed to keep your head down and be quiet until you've proven that you're adding value. So I think first off, for some teachers, it's not bad that there's a culture of, earning your stripes a little bit before you start shooting your mouth off. I think that's fine. But you don't have to be a superstar in order to be somebody who has good ideas about how the school can help you do better or about how the system can help you do better. So it's not like you need to become a superstar before you should be permitted to speak. You just need to have enough experience under your belt that you actually can speak with street level expertise and that you're starting to earn that moral authority. And then how do you do that? I think one, teachers need to create norms around their schools that support positive behaviors and get people in a cage-busting mindset. A couple examples are, Jean Del Cole talks about how when she went to the New Jersey State Department of Ed, she just had to put her foot down and say, look, we are not going to have these BMW meetings, these bitch, moan, and whine sessions. If you're going to speak up, identify an opportunity to do better and make sure you have an idea about how we can do it better. Otherwise, you're just complaining. A second thing is a bunch of people talked about how at their schools, it's easy for faculty meetings or PLC meetings to get off track and just get into a rut. Principals can try to pull it back, but when you talk to principals, they say, it can be really hard because then it becomes a me against the teachers thing. So one of the things teachers can really do is work, especially, teacher leaders can work with their principal to make it a culture among teachers that when somebody starts complaining or when people start wasting time, that it's teachers challenging one another to do better. A third kind of thing is to make sure you're getting really concrete feedback and then using it. So in professional development, most feedback is cursory, partly because nobody actually believes it's going to be used. Excuse me. Anytime you're doing that kind of stuff at your school, make sure you, for instance, begin the next meeting each time by breaking down the feedback and really talking about it and putting it out there. So the idea is to make it safe for more teachers to start to think and talk this way and to at least change the norms so that it doesn't feel weird or unusual for teachers to be part of these conversations.
Great. And Jay asks, how do we battle the turnover rate of administrators every 3 to 4 years?
That's a great question. I think one, frankly, is that's one reason I would love to see more teacher-run schools. Kind of the co-op model, like a law firm or a medical practice where 20, there's about 60 or 70 across the country now. There should be a lot more, I hope, in the years to come, where teachers, form their own charter or take advantage of a pilot or turn around. And they say, look, we're going to run this thing, and we're going to run it as a co-op. And you can have a managing partner. Teachers can be co-principals. You can, however you want to organize it. But that's one way. Second way, more practical for the other, 100,000 schools in the country, is nobody's ever holding school boards or superintendents' feet to the fire for turnover. There's, there's news stories about it, but usually everybody's so excited about the new superintendent, and usually everybody's saying nice things about the new principal, and the principal's getting promoted, blah, blah, that it's just part of the fabric. So, for instance, for teachers to make sure that they're showing up at board meetings and saying, look, leadership stability is important for us being able to do our job well. What are you guys doing to cut down on ludicrous kind of administrator turnover at schools or systems? For teachers to show up and talk about, collect that kind of data. How many principals are in place, at schools that are doing okay? And what is, and push the district. What are they doing to make sure that they're not losing principals or not creating unnecessary turnover? Frankly, this is, and again, you can do this in a hostile, destructive way, but this is the kind of stuff that nobody's going to think about as much or as thoughtfully or as intuitively as educators. And so if teachers are at the table talking about turnover of administrators as a problem and offering solutions, that's suddenly a way to talk about something that people have just ignored or overlooked for pretty much forever.
So the next question is a little bit lengthier.
Yeah, I see it.
Okay, great.
So it's really, how do you define a problem? So one thing I would say is, there's different fancy ways of talking about problem definition. One is design thinking. Another that I think is more relevant is what they call root cause analysis. And the simple way to put it is like, look, most of the districts talk about how data-driven they are nowadays. Mostly what they mean is they're testing kids in reading and math with a lot of formative assessments, and they're giving you data on which kids have mastered which elements. That's fine. But all that does is help you narrowly tailor reading and math instruction more aggressively within a traditional classroom. What schools tend to collect almost no data on, and certainly don't report, is how much turnover do you get of administrators? How much time are kids wasting on iPads because they don't remember their password or login? How many minutes of instruction are lost a day to announcements? How many assemblies are called in the course of a year? How many, which schools do you see lax disciplinary standards enforced by the administrators? And how do you, so part of what's missing in order to define clear problems is just a good data on what's actually happening in schools in ways that affects the quality of the teaching and learning that teachers can champion. So one, work with your school, with your system, to think about important things that everybody agrees are important that we don't know enough about. Then let's work with those guys to get your hands on that. And that helps make problems clear, like negative feedback on professional development or how many minutes are wasted in meetings. And I think what happens there is that lets you get much more concrete and precise in a way that people can say, oh, I see what you're talking about.
All right, well, it looks like we're getting close to 8 o'clock. So unless there's one final question maybe that wants to come up, give it a second. Otherwise, I think we'll close up here. Rick, thank you so much for your time tonight. We really appreciate it. This was a wonderful presentation.
Hey, my pleasure.
Great. I want to remind everyone that the webinar is being recorded and it will be posted on the NSTOY website in the coming days. So feel free to share it and view it again and whatever you like. So thank you very much, Rick.
Hey, thanks, everybody.
Have a great night.
Bye, y'all too.